a dear friend of ours who has been a peace builder and a peace advocate for 40 years in Northern Ireland, often repeats this phrase that it is not the religion that radicalizes people. It is their homes being destroyed. It is their schools being destroyed. It is their hospitals being destroyed. We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
You are very welcome to our second video for the Colonizer's World Tour coverage of Iraq this week. This is our final section of Chapter 1 for Book 2, where we've been talking about global women's stories for the month of March 2022. And we talked a lot about Iraq yesterday in our 101 coverage, but we didn't talk a lot about women. As we said, there's not a lot of demographic data, and there's not a lot of access that we can find to stories told about Iraqi women by Iraqi women in terms of books or things on the internet, which if you watched our 101 yesterday and you know how unstable the country's been for the last 40 years, it shouldn't be a surprise. But Dr. Kristen and her magic Googling fingers was able to find for us Iraq, the women's story, which she found on the website documentary Haven. It is available on YouTube. It was uploaded in 2013 onto YouTube, but we think it was filmed in 2006 because there are several references from the narrator about looking at what Iraq looked like 3 years after the invasion. So the American invasion in 2003, 3 years after that would have been 2006. There's another reference as well to November 2005 as last November. So I think we're best guessing here on this one. And it was shown on Channel 4 in the UK because we do get that Chiron in there as well. So it's the story of a woman who remains anonymous for her own protection, who decided to travel around and talk to women in Iraq about what life is like in Iraq, and specifically what it's like for women at this point in the invasion. And so it's a real, time machine back to what it looked like in the early days of the American occupation. And yeah, she just basically goes around. She talks to some of her friends who are working in aid. She talks to women who are doctors and nurses in different parts of Iraq. She goes closer to the Iranian border. She goes down to Basra, which is even at this time, a more religiously conservative part of Iraq, and talks to women and gets some stories. It's very little surprised both Dr. Kristen and I from this in terms of what we heard, but we do have a couple things we want to talk about and make sure that we highlight as we finish up our coverage of Iraq. Dr. Kristen, what struck you, stood out, and or do you want to comment about?
The real value of this kind of thing is in the in-between moments, like the driving in the car and the conversations while they're making dinner. And like the interviews are great, don't get me wrong. But what I really loved was the kind of lived of like, oh, we're going to spend 6 hours in traffic now because of all the roadblocks. And all of those small moments that never make like a Harper's Bazaar piece, but help me understand the lived experience a lot better. It's much more it's much more anthropological, which is really what we're always looking for, is the kind of, the lived experience. I loved the woman doctor who kept saying like, and the dudes just keep coming in here and I have to keep fighting with them. I was like, oh, that's so just like normal. Yeah. And that felt really good. One of the lines that struck me is, I wish the American taxpayers could see how their money is being spent.
Oh, yeah.
And I think about the narratives in 2006 and what was on television. I was living in Northern Ireland for a part of that. And I remember people coming up to me in bars in Northern Ireland and asking who I voted for.
Yeah.
Flat out. And asking what I thought about the invasion. And using language that was not used. Like, in the United States, we never talked about it as an occupation or an invasion. No. So the first time I heard it talked about as an invasion, I was living in Belfast. Mm-hmm. And somebody said, how do you justify the invasion? And I was like, I don't think about it. I don't know. And I'm not saying there weren't Americans who weren't thinking, who were not thinking about it. I just wasn't one of those. And so it was, I think we thought we knew what they were doing. And what was even worse is that those people who had been protesting it knew exactly what was being done with our tax dollars.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a lot of that just because that was kind of around the time of my political consciousness in your 20s, like in your teens. There are some teenagers that are that politically conscious, but 2000 was the first election we were both of age to vote in. And so I remember that. I remember a lot about the lead up to the invasion, the justification for it, the jokes about looking under chairs and desks for weapons of mass destruction. There's a intersection not far from my house, right at the intersection where the bridge collapsed in Pittsburgh, if anybody saw that on the national news. And for every day I think of Bush's presidency, there were people protesting on that corner with signs about the Iraq War. So I remember that, like, distinctly. But I agree with you, like, the value of this is to see what that looks like outside of newsreels. Because and we've seen this a lot, as we're filming this in March 2022, news in the United States is 99% the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we're seeing it a lot, but we're seeing it through the lens a lot of news reporters. But we also have social media now. So we're getting a lot of TikTok videos and YouTube videos and all this kind of stuff from people on the ground. But back then we didn't have all of that. So we saw it all through the lens of the reporters and whatever nationality they were representing. So it's invaluable to have this, like, woman with a camcorder. And it's, for me, one of the lines that really stuck out in the beginning is as she's driving around Baghdad and explaining kind of the segregation of different people groups and the kind of carceral state that is set up by the roadblocks. And someone she's speaking to just said, Iraq is going to become a collection of prisons. Because we're, the state is putting, kind of creating ghettos for the minority Muslim population. The difference between Sunni and Shia is being mapped out on the physical geography and the landscape of these towns. Obviously Yazidis and Christian groups and all of this is happening. And then there's the United States military occupation, which is just forcing people to drive from barricade to barricade. But yeah, for me, it's important to remember that this is from the lens of people that were living through the invasion and occupation and experiencing it. And as you mentioned in the 101 video, but it's worth repeating, a dear friend of ours who has been a peace builder and a peace advocate for 40 years in Northern Ireland, often repeats this phrase that it is not the religion that radicalizes people. It is their homes being destroyed. It is their schools being destroyed. It is their hospitals being destroyed. And we, the narrator and documentarian visits a female doctor working in a town near the border with Iran that has been like taken over by the United States, almost entirely destroyed. And she goes to the doctor takes her to the ruins of the hospital that was bombed and destroyed by American bombs. And there are these boys, these young boys, like playing in the rubble. And the narrator also has an aid worker with her, who's a friend of hers. And the woman like leans over into the rubble and like yells at the boys. And she's like, "What are you going to do? Are you going to fight back? Are you going to defend your country? Like, are you going to fight the Americans?" And the boys were like, "Yeah, we are. And she just turns to the camera and she goes, "Those Americans have come to destroy everything." And, you know, when she's looking at these boys who could be orphans or, you know, homeless, refugees, playing in the rubble of a hospital, why would you think differently? And for me, that's, you know, I didn't learn a whole lot that surprised me from this, but it was valuable to see it. And none of what these people said surprised me. That same woman earlier on was like, what have they done? What have they done but destroy buildings and make orphans of children?
Yeah, and there was evidently some propaganda at some point that, like, when we came in and killed Saddam, which it does not sound like anyone is sad we did.
No, let us be clear about that.
It's the after that we would then help them rebuild.
Yeah.
We would come and rebuild, and that's what we would do.
Schools, infrastructure, water access.
Like, God, we would have been, there wouldn't be insurgency if we gave them water. There might be ISIS, but that's not the insurgents, and that wasn't the conversation in 2006. Anyway, I was struck the whole time. I'm glad this is an hour, because it's all, I think, in a way, like, narratively, like, you can just summarize the narrative as being, like, we need to listen to the occupied. Mm-hmm. And as the same as the occupiers. Yeah. And so the material doesn't hold for more than an hour.
No, and it's lacking a lot of context and nuance, which is totally understandable.
Oh, yeah.
But it's always important to remember that we're getting a very specific perspective and interpretation of events and how they unfolded.
And we know from scholars and friends of ours on the ground that there were Iraqis who were totally fine with us there and worked alongside of us and enjoyed us being there and made money from the American occupation. So there's never two sides to a story. There's always 15. We say that frequently. Yeah. But this particular perspective is one that is often completely left out. Yeah. Specifically about, like, the women talking about what they bombed the schools. They bomb schools? Why'd they do that? And just the utter confusion of they said there was insurgents there. Well, how do they know? Right. They bombed my kid's school.
And I think too, like, we've talked about women's stories this whole month, global women's stories, and focused on different aspects of them. And this one is so valuable just for, again, reemphasizing the role that women play in conflicts, in violent conflicts. And we get a lot of that anthropological kind of perspective and backstory as we're just seeing the lived experiences of these women. And they're talking about refugee crisis and homelessness and what happens. And these, that's what the woman said. This is, what have they done but make orphans of children? But when men become the primary combatants in a conflict, then women are the caregivers for family members, for children. If men die in conflict or become incarcerated, as happened to a lot of Iraqi men, then women become the primary breadwinners. And, like, there's a conversation with a woman that's like, I need to feed my kids, but there's no jobs. Like, unemployment is zero. Nobody's hiring anything, like, the country's in a war. But I need a job because my husband is dead and I have 3 kids. And that's what happens to women. And we're seeing that even now with the Russian invasion in the Ukraine. We're seeing it a very gendered story in terms of conflict. And it's always important for us to remember that because it's very easy to focus on the combatants who are almost always mostly male.
Yeah.
But this is the women's story of what happens in war is told in this documentary.
So we're going to hit pause here on our Iraq coverage. I'm sure we'll revisit it at some point. We hope that you have learned something. We hope that you've been able to hold multiple stories in your perspective, because that's the point of Colonizer's World Tour at all times. And then we also hope that you'll join us next month when we spend the entire month of April talking about Brazil. We're going to kick off with a conversation about the economy and the politics. We'll be reviewing the I'm learning, famous documentary Edge of Democracy, which is a lot about the Petrobras scandal, which we will talk about in depth, because you can't talk about Brazil without talking about Petrobras and Bolsonaro. So we will talk about both of those things for sure. We'll see you the first week of April for that. In the meantime, please do all the YouTube things, like this video, subscribe to our channel. If you want to make sure you don't miss a single bit of our content, the link to our newsletter is below, and you want to be on it because there's lots of stuff coming up this year that is going to be, including, little teaser, a live online training called Words We Don't Say Anymore. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to want to miss that. Our deep hope for you is that you are somewhere where there is no fear of your hospital being bombed. And if you are somewhere where that is true, wherever in the world that is, we wish for you safety. We wish for you peace, every element of that word. And we wish for you calm in your soul and potentially in your country. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. Bye.
See you next time.